This is the game that won the Superbet Chess Classic for Fabiano Caruana. It was his game against Jan Nepomniachtchi, and this is a really tough fight, and Fabiano squeezes the most out of this position. A really impressive game. Let's begin. Fabiano has white, Nepo has black. He begins by playing d4. Nepo responds with knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and c5. Nepomniachtchi offers to play the Tarrasch defense, which is a system where black is willing to take on an isolated queen's pawn in return for piece activity. Now, in this position, if cd5, Nepo might have gone ahead and played the semi-Tarrasch with knight to d5, avoiding that isolated pawn. But instead, Caruana plays e3. Now he's a little more comfortable getting into that isolated queen's pawn position. Knight c6, cd5, ed5, and bishop to b5 is played by Caruana, putting some pressure on the c6 knight. Maybe he could play knight e5, make it uncomfortable. cd4, knight takes d4, bishop to d7, castles, and Nepo plays the bishop to d6. The most aggressive square, probably. It aims at the h2 pawn. Maybe he could play the Greek gift later if Caruana is caught napping. But it's definitely an aggressive square for the bishop. So knight to f3 is played by Caruana. Not only does that return the knight to a better defensive square, but it avoids the exchange of pieces. The side playing against the isolated queen's pawn wants to avoid an exchange of pieces. It also is aiming at this d5 pawn. So he's threatening to capture that at the moment. So bishop to e6 was played by Nepo. b3 to develop this last piece, the bishop at c1, last minor piece, I should say. a6 kicks the bishop goes to d3, and now knight to e5. As we said, the side with the isolated queen's pawn usually wants to avoid the exchange of pieces. But in this case, Nepo is offering to exchange off a very strong defensive piece for white, and he's a little more comfortable doing that. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. The bishop is strong on this square, aiming at h2, and of course threatening to just take the knight on c3, so Caruana plays bishop to b2 to challenge it. And now rook to c8, which is a novelty. Before, players castled, attacking the c3 knight twice. Rook to c1, defending it. Castles, and here Caruana comes up with a very strong, aggressive idea for white in this position. He plays the move f4, and this does a couple of things. First of all, of course, it gains space on the king side, but it also kicks this bishop at e5 away from this nice long diagonal, and that gives Caruana a little more control over that line. Bishop goes to c7. Now knight to e2. The bishop is on the diagonal, and the knight is aiming for the d4 square, a very strong square for a knight because it can't be kicked out by a pawn. That's a very weak square. Bishop to b6, aiming at the king and making the e3 pawn a target. Bishop to d4, offering to exchange that off, which it is, and knight takes d4. The knight is very well placed on this d4 square. Queen to a5, attacking the a2 pawn. Queen to e2, defending it. Rook f to e8, placing the rook opposite the queen down the e-file. h3, keeping a piece out of g4, and maybe going to expand with g4 himself later. The bishop comes back to d7, and Caruana exchanges off one pair of rooks. The ideal piece formation for the player playing against an isolated queen's pawn is queen and rook versus queen and rook. He won't get that ideal formation, but that's sort of the goal. Queen to b2, placing the queen on that nice long diagonal. Queen to c5, a4, a5, queen back to d2, b6, and rook to b1. And at this point, the commentators were beginning to see this game as having a peaceful resolution. They thought this would probably be a draw, but they didn't see what was going to happen after a few moves. Queen to a3 was played by Nepo, putting the queen deep in Caruana's position. King to h2, avoiding any potential back rank checks. h6, rook to b2, queen to e7, rook c2, rook c5. You probably don't want to take the rook here because now that knight would lose its very comfortable place on d4. So he actually plays the knight back to f3. Rook takes c2, bishop takes c2, queen to c5. He moves the bishop out of the way of the queen. King to f8. The knight goes back to its nice square. King to g8, king to g1, and we continue with some maneuvering. Queen to b2, and king to f8, knight to c2. And here, Nepo decides to make a committal decision. He decides to introduce a new imbalance into the game that could give one side or the other winning chances. He plays the move knight to e4 check, and Caruana does take it. And here we have another imbalance added to the game, a knight versus a bishop. And I think it's fair to say the knight is actually better than the bishop here. The main reason being it has a really nice square on d4 that it can land on. Also, queens and knights work better together than queens and bishops, because a queen and a bishop are redundant. They do the same thing, but a queen and knight, they work together very, very well. The knight goes to d4, bishop to c6, queen e2, queen c3, putting some pressure on b3 and e3, although they're both defended at the moment. Queen to a6, aiming at the b6 pawn, queen to d2 check, forcing knight to e2, queen to b4, queen to c8 check, attacking the king and the bishop, so the bishop has to interpose the check. Queen c2, white wants to attack e4 here and draw forward the f5 pawn, which would basically limit the scope of the white squared bishop even more and expose the black king. The bishop goes to d7. If he plays f5, which actually is okay in this position, knight d4, g6, queen to c1, because he can put the bishop on f7. In this position, black probably is okay. But after bishop to d7, the bishop isn't as well placed. Knight to d4 and f5. And after this move, black gets in some trouble, because you'll notice not only is white's knight better, but Caruana's queen controls the c-file, and he's able to use that immediately to gain an edge. Queen to c7, attacking the bishop on d7. Queen to d2 check. Again, the knight has to go back. Bishop moves from the threat and aims at the b3 pawn. The queen takes b6, also defending the b3 pawn. King to f7, queen to d4, queen to a2, and you can see the queen and bishop both aiming at b3. So queen to a7 check, hitting the king and the a5 pawn. The king moves, one more check, and then queen takes a5. Now, Nepo could take on b3 here, let's say with the queen, but then knight to d4, and after queen to a2 check, king to g3, and if the bishop moves, knight takes f5, and he would get a key f5 pawn. This would be clearly better for white. King to h8 is played, queen to d8 check, king h7, queen goes back to a5, and basically Caruana's main task here, he's got to figure out a way to advance these pawns on the queen side while containing Nepo's activity. So he's got to play a very careful balancing act. And after king h8, he makes a very committal, serious, and strong move. He plays the move b4, which allows Nepo to play bishop to c4. Now, it looks like Caruana might be in some trouble here. Nepo's putting a lot of pressure on the pinned knight on e2, but it turns out Caruana has worked this out. He plays queen to d8 check, king moves, and now queen goes back to d1, not only defending the knight, but also defending the pawn on a4. Bishop to b3 attacks the queen and the pawn. Queen to d7, however, counterattacks the pawn at f5, so he decides to go to e6, queen to b5, defending the a and b pawns and also putting pressure on f5. King to h8, queen to c5. If queen to a4 here, then knight to d4, and the f5 pawn is going to be falling very, very soon. So g6 to defend that pawn, but it exposes the king quite a bit more. King to e1. Caruana wants to step out of the pin. He wants this knight to become active on, excuse me, not here. He wants this knight to become active on the d4 square. And he also wants to get his king further into the game. So he plays king to e1, king to g8, queen to d6, king to f7, queen to d2. Now, white would obviously be happy to trade queens here and just advance these two a and b pawns. That would be a very easy endgame. But Nepo takes the pawn at a4, but that allows knight to d4. So Caruana has given up a pawn, but he's used that time that black took to take the pawn to get his knight back on the strong d4 square. The bishop moves to c4, king to f2, h5, king to g3, queen to a3, b5, beginning to advance the pawn, and queen to d3. Now, Caruana does not want to exchange queens here, because then after ed3, this pawn is only 2 squares away from queening, and black is close to, if not completely equal in that position. So he avoids that by playing queen to c1. Now bishop takes b5, queen to c7 check, king to f8. And you see the final move? That's right. Queen to c5 check with a double attack on the king and the bishop. And by the way, Nepo could have played anything other than king to f8. The double attack would still have been on the board. There was no way to avoid it. And in this position, seeing he was going to lose his bishop, Nepomniachtchi resigned. And this game, which was close and was headed towards a draw, is really what put Caruana that half game up to win the Superbet Chess Classic. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.